So next we're going to do the diencephalon and the pituitary gland. So the diencephalon is this region just deep to the fornix. So we're going to wrap that around. And it has three parts. We have the thalamus, which is a sensory relay. So sensory information comes up from your spinal cord. It connects into the thalamus, and then the thalamus relays that up to the parietal lobe. This acts as a screen. You don't process every single sensory you have. Otherwise, your sensory input would be overwhelming. As an experiment that you can do in your home right now, take 3 quarters and put them on your forearm. Doesn't matter anterior or posterior, and you should feel them sitting there. Close your eyes and think about when you lose sense of them. And at some point, your brain will phase it out because it's not important. So this is how we phase out smells that we don't need. We don't think about how our shoes feel, all that stuff, because if it's not a threat, the thalamus is trying to make sure that we can pay attention to the important input. We also have the hypothalamus, which is this little region down here. The hypothalamus has about 12 different functions, and I've only hit the highlights. It's about 3 grams of tissue, and it controls a lot. It controls your blood pressure, your water balance in your body, if you're thirsty, or if your body water balance is off, so that we have something called your osmolarity is off. It's going to help regulate sleep and wake cycles. Histamine, which is the same chemical that in your skin causes itching. So when the mosquito bites you, it releases histamine. This causes the itching. In your brain, it keeps you awake, which is why if you take an antihistamine like Benadryl, you feel sleepy. I like to say you stay awake because your brain is itching, or at least your hypothalamus is. It's also going to control body temperature, which is why when you get sick, you have a fever. We lose that one. It controls the autonomic nervous system, which was a different lecture. It controls hunger and what we call satiation, the feeling of feeling full. So hunger is balanced with feeling full. Salt balance. If you've ever just really craved salt, probably your hypothalamus talking to you. And it also controls the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland isn't technically part of the diencephalon. The anterior pituitary actually is a piece of skin that broke off from the roof of your mouth, basically drifted up through the membrane because there's no bone yet, and attached itself to the brain. So the pituitary gland is largely, the anterior portion is all epithelium. The posterior is an extension from the hypothalamus, but it's called the master gland of the body. It controls most of the major hormones of the body, including growth hormone, all the hormones that regulate male and female puberty and reproduction. It regulates the hormones dealing with stress like cortisol, metabolism like the thyroid hormones. It does all of that. And finally, the epithalamus, which I'm coming around the screen. The epithalamus is on the posterior of the thalamus. It's also called the pineal gland. The pineal gland is part of sleep and wake also. It's the one that produces the neurohormone called melatonin. Sometimes when people have sleep issues, they'll take melatonin. It largely regulates sleep and hibernation. So animals that have are hibernating will have a larger epithalamus or pineal gland than animals that don't hibernate. The mesencephalon and the midbrain are the next piece, and the midbrain is where all of the tracts, all the nerves coming down from the cerebrum have to come through here, and it's the origin of cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor neuron. And this is why if somebody has the diagnosis of fixed and dilated pupils, that's a bad sign, because it means that the midbrain is broken. The brain stem is broken, because if the cranial nerve number 3, that origin, if it's broken and cannot constrict the pupil, because remember it's parasympathetic, this part of the brain is gone. And this is the one of the big signs of brain death. Now, the thing about brain death is that it means that all the brain cells superior to this will die. There was a case many years ago of a woman in a car accident. Her name was Terry Schiavo in Florida, and she was diagnosed as being brain dead, but her family fought her being taken off life support. And when it was finally done, it was almost 10 years after she'd actually been in the car accident. And when they did the autopsy, they found that the cells of her brain had actually died to the point where all the macrophages had removed it. So her skull only had fluid. All she had left was the lower portion of her brain stem. So she was actually dead. They just kept her alive on life support. The other piece of the midbrain is the corpora quadrigemini, the body of four twins. They're called the superior and inferior colliculi. One of them is called a colliculus. We have four of them, so we call them in pairs the colliculi. We have two sets. We have the superior pair that are here. They are responsible for visual reflexes. Visual reflexes, something like you see something out of the corner of your eye and you turn to look at it, or you turn to track something. If something's moving and you start noticing it to move and you start following it. This is how we might see a rodent or a spider, or we see something fly across the sky. This is the superior colliculi. The inferior colliculi are this lower bump with the red arrow, and they're about auditory reflexes. Things like you hear a door slam and you turn to look at it. Auditory tracking, you hear a sound and you're trying to figure out where it comes from. One of the first things you do is you turn your head to see, is it coming from in front of you, behind you, and you're trying to audio locate it. The other day, my cat got locked in something, and I found him because I could hear where he was coming from and meowing, and he let me know that he'd managed to get himself shut into a kitchen cupboard. He's clever getting in, not so clever getting out, because he managed to trigger the child safety lock. So inferior colliculi are about auditory reflexes. Coming down into the metencephalon, we get the pons and the cerebellum. The pons is this almond-shaped thing. I want to stress this is pons, P-O-N-S. It is not pond, P-O-N-D. If you put the D in it, I will ask you if you have frogs and fishies in your brain. The pons is a relay of sensory information from the cerebrum. So we have sensory information comes up. It's also going to come back down into the pons to be taken into the cerebellum. The cerebellum and the cerebrum are different things. The cerebellum is this structure here at the base of the brain. The internal white tracts there are called the arbor vitae. Arbor means tree, vitae means life. So they are the white tracts. It's the tree of life. And the cerebellum is about motor coordination. There's a couple different videos showing somebody trying to touch their nose, and they can do it fine with one side, and they can't do it at all with the other because they can't coordinate the movement. It's also about memory for learned motor patterns. Patterns like walking, driving, riding a bicycle, playing an instrument. That's supposed to be an instrument, not and. I mentioned a little bit ago the guy who had his hippocampus cut for epilepsy. And one of the things they did is he was living in Toronto, and he was part of the university system there. And they brought in a piano player, and he would tell her every day, no, I don't remember meeting you. And he didn't, but sure, I'll take a piano lesson. And the thing is, he never remembered having a piano lesson, but he learned to play the piano because it was motor memory and it was stored in the cerebellum, which was not damaged, but he couldn't consciously remember doing it because his memory in his cerebrum was damaged. So this is about walking, driving, anything that takes motor skill. And finally, we get down to the myelencephalon, which is the medulla oblongata. This is this piece that is the very base of the brain stem. So it's the brain stem just before it becomes the spinal cord. The medulla oblongata has the cardiac control and respiratory control. Cardiac control in terms of raising or lowering your heart rate as you need. You go for a walk, you exercise, that's going to increase your heart rate. You're sitting on the couch, you're relaxing, that's going to lower your heart rate. And respiratory control. The thing about respiration, breathing is based on skeletal muscle. So we have what's called a respiratory control center here that sends the signal down to your diaphragm muscle to cause you to breathe. And it's based on how much CO2 you have in your blood. So that's very important. So that is the medulla oblongata. You need it to keep the heart going and the breathing going. So we like that.